A millionaire recognizes his former employee stranded on a lonely highway. She's clutching a stuffed animal with a name stitched onto it. Behind that name is a truth he never should have ignored. The black SUV gleamed like the sun had picked it out on purpose against all that dust and silence. Robert Callahan was doing almost 70 miles an hour when he saw her. It wasn't a shape. It wasn't a shadow. It was a flash of pink at the edge of the highway in the middle of absolute nowhere. A flash of color that something inside him recognized before his mind even finished processing what his eyes were seeing. He hit the brakes without thinking. The SUV rolled to a stop about 50 yards from the most forgotten bus stop he had ever seen in his life. 4 wooden planks nailed to crooked posts, a rusted tin roof that didn't seem to serve any purpose anymore. And sitting on that bench, worn down by time and neglect, was a woman. Robert didn't get out right away. He sat there watching her from inside the car, the air conditioning humming softly, as if that artificial cold could shield him from what he was starting to feel. That uncomfortable sensation of recognizing something you can't quite name yet. The feeling that shows up right before memory calls in a debt you owe. The woman didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the empty road, on that horizon of dirt and sky that promised nothing. Her hands held a small, worn pink teddy bear against her chest, its neck ribbon half undone. It wasn't the kind of thing a grown woman carries out of habit or whim. It was the kind of thing you carry when there's nothing else left to hold on to. Robert Callahan was in his mid-40s. 3 companies running across 4 states. A house in the hills outside the city, and a bank account most people would envy. He'd built all of it with a discipline that bordered on coldness, making decisions others wouldn't dare make, closing doors that other people left cracked open out of sentiment or guilt. He was not a man who stopped. He was not a man who looked back. But there he was, stopped, looking back. He got out of the car. The heat hit him like a clean slap, different from city heat, which always comes mixed with noise and motion and the illusion that something is happening. This was a dry, honest heat, the kind that doesn't apologize, the kind that doesn't let you lie to yourself. His Italian leather shoes hit the sandy dirt, and he walked toward the bus stop with that confident stride he'd cultivated for decades, the stride of a man who knows exactly where he's going. But for the first time in a long time, he genuinely did not know where he was going. When he was about 10 feet away, the woman turned her head. Her eyes were dark and deep, and in them Robert read in a fraction of a second an entire history. Real exhaustion, intact dignity, and something that wasn't fear but the exact opposite. It was the look of someone who has already lost everything, and because of that, no longer fears whatever might come next. And that's when he recognized her. Not completely, not with total certainty, but with that uneasy certainty of seeing a face that's been sleeping for years in some forgotten corner of memory and suddenly shows up uninvited. "Do you need help?" he asked. His own voice sounded strange to him, too formal for that place, too distant for what he was actually feeling. The woman studied him for a full second, as if calculating something he couldn't see. She didn't answer. Not a single word. No hostility, no warmth, just the truth stated in the most direct way possible. Robert didn't move. "You've been here a while. The next bus on this route doesn't come for hours," he said. And he wondered, even as he said it, how he knew that with such precision. It was a route he'd taken exactly once, years ago, back when his company was just starting out, and flights weren't in the budget. "I know," she answered. And this time something in her voice tightened just slightly. The kind of tension that shows up when someone is very carefully trying not to recognize you. Robert stepped closer. "Denise," he said softly. The name came on its own, without him searching for it. And when he said it out loud, he saw her shoulders stiffen almost imperceptibly, just a fraction of an inch. Just enough to confirm he'd gotten it right. The silence between them took on physical weight. "Robert Callahan," she said finally, without looking at him. It was a confirmation and an accusation, spoken in exactly the same tone. He didn't answer right away. He needed to piece together the fragments his memory was assembling with sudden urgency. Denise Ruiz had worked for him in his first real office, back when Callahan Construction still occupied a single floor in a building that wasn't even his. Executive assistant. Serious, efficient, always 10 minutes early. And then at some point, he couldn't pin down exactly, she had simply stopped being there. The way so many people had stopped being there in Robert Callahan's life. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. And this time it didn't sound formal, it sounded genuine. It sounded like what it was, the question of a man seeing something he doesn't understand and, for once in his life, being honest enough to admit it. Denise pulled the teddy bear a little tighter against her chest. "Waiting for the bus." "Where are you headed?" She turned her face toward him fully, and Robert saw then what the distance had hidden from him. The edges of exhaustion carved with precision around her eyes. Not the tiredness of one bad night's sleep, the accumulated exhaustion of weeks, of months, the kind that doesn't go away with rest because it comes from somewhere deeper. "Why do you care?" she asked without venom, just genuine curiosity, almost clinical, as if she were studying an animal behaving in a way she hadn't expected at all. Robert had no answer, and that silence was in itself the whole answer. "Get in," he said. "I'll take you wherever you need to go." "No, Robert." She cut him off with a calm that completely threw him off balance. 3 years ago, you let me go, with no warning. No severance, no reference letter. Your secretary handed me an envelope at the front desk, while your lawyers had already cleared out my office. A short, clean pause. "I don't need you to take me anywhere." The words landed on the dry ground like stones, one at a time. Robert felt something he rarely experienced, real shame. Not the shallow shame of a miscalculation in a boardroom, the deep kind, the kind with no quick exit. The shame of someone who acted for years as if another human being wasn't quite a person, but a piece inside a system. "You're right," he said. Denise blinked. She hadn't expected that. "You're right about all of it," Robert repeated calmly. "And I have no excuse that holds up. But right now, you're on an empty highway in 100 degrees, and the next bus is hours away. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Can I give you a ride?" Denise looked at him for a stretch of time that seemed to stop completely. Then she lowered her eyes to the teddy bear resting in her hands. "St. Anne's Public Hospital," she said finally. And on the last word, her voice cracked, just barely, just enough for him to hear it. Robert felt something shift inside his chest. "Are you sick?" "It's not me." Those 3 words changed the air before they'd even reached the car. They walked in silence. Robert opened the passenger door, an automatic gesture that in any other circumstance would have been simple protocol, and in this one, felt like the only honest thing he could do. Denise got in without thanking him and without refusing him. She set the teddy bear on her lap, and that's when Robert noticed what he hadn't seen from a distance. On the bear's left ear, a name was stitched in blue thread, small, careful letters. Grace. The car pulled onto the empty highway. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. The air conditioning hummed its quiet hum again. Outside, the landscape stayed the same. Dust, dry brush, a horizon that promised nothing. But inside, something had shifted irreversibly, the way air pressure changes right before a storm hits. Robert felt the ground open up beneath him. He had let this woman go 3 years ago, with no name, no face, no story, because at that moment his company was going through a restructuring, and the numbers said to cut staff, and he had signed the paperwork without stopping to read the names because to him they were positions on an org chart, not people with entire lives outside the office. Denise Ruiz had been position number 47 on the layoff list. Now she was Grace's mother. And Grace was a 4-year-old girl with a name stitched in blue thread on the ear of a worn pink bear that her mother carried against her chest at a bus stop in the middle of nowhere. "Do you have anyone, family?" "Grace's father." Denise turned her face toward the window. Grace's father left when she was 6 months old, right when the diagnosis came. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a cold, plain fact, like the temperature of a stone. "My mom passed away last year. I have a sister up north, but she's got her own troubles going on. A brief pause. So, no, I don't have anyone. 4 words spoken without any drama, without fishing for pity, just the loneliest truth Robert had ever heard in his life. St. Anne's Public Hospital appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. A gray concrete building with peeling walls, hallways crowded with waiting people, and that particular atmosphere of places where life and fear share the same corridor. Robert pulled up to the main entrance. Denise grabbed the teddy bear, opened the door, and before stepping out, turned back toward him with that formality that was her last remaining shield. Thanks for the ride. Wait, Robert said. She stopped. What room is Grace in? Denise's eyes narrowed. Legitimate, fully justified distrust. Why? Robert didn't answer right away because the honest answer was also the hardest thing he'd had to say in years of meetings, contracts, and negotiations. Because I want to see her, he said finally. Why? The question hung in the air of that afternoon, and the only true answer Robert Callahan had in that moment was also the most devastating one he'd ever put into words. Because I think it's partly my fault that you're out here alone. Denise looked at him for a length of time that had no measure, and then without another word she got out of the car and waited for him to do the same. The man who had everything was about to discover the one thing he was missing, seeing himself through the eyes of someone he had failed without ever realizing it. And what he was about to find inside that hospital would change his life and Grace's forever. St. Anne's Public Hospital smelled like disinfectant and waiting. Robert Callahan had spent his whole life in private clinics, places where silence was part of the service, where nurses spoke in hushed tones, and the hallways had framed art and plants tucked into corners. Places where money turned suffering into something more bearable, more orderly, easier to look at. This was different. The pediatric hallway had cartoon characters painted on the walls, once colorful, now faded by time into pale tones that didn't cheer anyone up anymore. Every chair in the waiting area was filled with families carrying that particular weight of people who haven't slept well in days. An older woman prayed silently a rosary between her fingers. A young man stared at the floor, elbows on his knees, jaw clenched. A little girl, maybe 6, slept on what looked like her grandmother's lap, mouth slightly open, completely unaware of everything around her. Robert walked behind Denise without saying a word. She moved through that hallway with the ease of someone who knew every tile by heart. She nodded to nurses on shift. She asked about Grace with that mix of urgency and control that only mothers develop, the ones who've learned to hide their panic so it doesn't spill onto their kids. How was she this morning? She asked a nurse whose name tag read Pat. Calmer than yesterday, the woman answered with that specific warmth that comes from working with sick children and developing a tenderness that can survive anything. She's been asking for you since early. I told her you'd be here this afternoon, and that settled her right down. Denise closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them and kept walking. Robert saw that gesture and felt something he couldn't name in the moment, but which was without a doubt a kind of blow. Room 14B was at the end of the corridor. Denise stopped in front of the door, turned to Robert, and looked at him with an expression that was half warning, half something he couldn't read yet. She doesn't know anything about you, she said. She doesn't know you're my old boss. She doesn't know anything about the company. All she knows is that her mom works hard so she can get better. A pause. I don't want that to change today. Understood, Robert said. And if at any point she gets tired or agitated, you leave. No arguing. Understood. Denise studied him one more moment, searching for any sign he was lying. She found none. Then she gently pushed the door open. The first thing Robert noticed was the color. In an otherwise gray, sterile room with one small window and medical equipment mounted on the wall, there was a hospital bed with rails, and in that bed, covered to the waist with a white sheet, surrounded by 3 drawings taped to the wall, flowers, clouds, and what looked like a house with smoke coming out of the chimney, was a little girl. Grace had dark hair like her mother's, pulled into 2 small pigtails someone had clearly done with care. Her cheeks were thin, but her eyes, when she looked up at the sound of the door, were huge and completely alive with that particular light kids get when they've been cooped up too long, and because of it, look at the world with an intensity most adults have long since lost. "Mom," she said, and in that single word were weeks of waiting, all compressed into one syllable. Denise crossed the room in 3 steps and hugged her daughter with that specific gentleness of someone holding something fragile and loved with an intensity language can't fully hold. The little girl buried her face in her mother's neck and stayed there, still saying nothing for a moment. Robert stood by the door, frozen, not knowing where to put his hands, not knowing where to put his eyes, not knowing, for the first time in many years, exactly what role he was supposed to play in the place where he was standing. It was Grace who noticed him first. She lifted her head from her mother's shoulder, saw him, and studied him with that absolute frankness kids have before they learn that staring at strangers is impolite. "Who's that man?" she asked, pointing straight at him. "A friend of Mom's," Denise answered without turning around. "What's his name?" "Robert," he said from the doorway, taking a step inside. Grace kept evaluating him for 3 more seconds. Then she nodded with the seriousness of someone who has just made an important decision. "My name's Grace, but everybody calls me Gracie. Except when I'm being bad, then it's Grace the whole thing." Despite everything, despite the hallway, the peeling walls, the weight of everything Denise had told him in the car, Robert felt something in his chest ease just slightly. "Nice to meet you, Gracie," he said. "Do you work at the laundromat with my mom, too?" "No." "Then what do you do?" "I build things." Grace considered that, with the same seriousness she'd applied to everything else. "Houses?" "Among other things." "I want me and Mom to have a house with a yard," she declared with the absolute conviction of a 4-year-old. "Right now, we live in one room, but it doesn't have a yard. I told Mom I want to have a plant. She said, when we get out of the hospital, we'll see." Denise, who had been smoothing the little girl's blankets with careful, gentle movements, said nothing, but Robert saw her fingers pause for an instant over the white fabric. Just an instant. Then they kept moving. Robert pulled a plastic chair up beside the bed and sat down, keeping a respectful distance, careful not to intrude on that space that clearly belonged to the two of them. For the next half hour, he watched. He watched as Denise told Grace about her day with a level of detail and energy that didn't match at all the exhaustion he'd seen on her face during the drive. He watched her invent small stories about the laundromat, about a pigeon that had flown in through the window that morning and caused a short, ridiculous bit of chaos, which made Grace laugh that laugh only kids have, the kind that fills a room no matter how small it is. He watched Grace, without anyone asking proudly, show off the drawings taped to the wall. "I made that one," she said, pointing to the house with smoke. "Nurse Pat brought me paper and crayons. See the smoke? That's because they're cooking something good inside." "What are they cooking?" Robert asked. Grace thought about it with total seriousness. "Soup with potatoes and carrots, like the kind Mom makes when it's cold out." Robert looked at Denise. She was looking at her daughter's drawing with an expression he couldn't fully read, but it had something of gratitude and something of pain tangled together in a way that couldn't be pulled apart. Then the doctor arrived. Dr. Marcus Feld had the look of someone who's delivered a lot of hard news over the years and somehow learned to do it without losing his humanity, which is probably the hardest way to practice any profession. He greeted Denise with the familiarity of someone who knew her well. He gently ruffled Grace's hair, which she accepted like it was old habit. And then, with a discreet glance at Robert, he asked Denise if they could step outside to talk. "Gracie, I'll be right back," Denise said, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Bring me juice from the machine," Grace requested. "If you're good, I get juice too," Dr. Feld told her with a wink, and Grace laughed. The 3 of them stepped into the hallway. The door closed softly. Dr. Feld looked at Robert with a question in his eyes. "He's trustworthy," Denise said simply. The doctor nodded and lowered his voice. "The latest test results confirm what we were worried about. The valve is deteriorating faster than we initially projected." He spoke with clinical precision, but his eyes stayed on Denise, watching how she took each word. We need to schedule the surgery within the next 3 weeks at the latest. If we wait longer, the surgical risk increases significantly. Denise listened without moving, with that stillness Robert already recognized as her way of absorbing blows. "And the cost is still the same?" she asked. Dr. Feld exhaled softly. "The procedure itself, with the specialized equipment we'd need to bring in the materials, the surgery, and post-op recovery, we're talking about a figure this hospital can't absorb without outside funding." A pause. "We've applied to 3 medical relief funds. 2 have already said no. The 3rd has a waiting list." "How long is that waiting list?" "Longer than we have." The silence in that hallway had a different quality than the silence on the highway. Out there it had been a lonely silence. Here it was a silence of impossibility. Denise nodded slowly. She nodded the way someone nods at a sentence they already knew was coming, and that still hurts exactly the same. "Understood. Thank you, doctor." The doctor squeezed her arm briefly before continuing down the hall. Denise stood by the wall, staring at the closed door of room 14B. Robert said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because in that moment he understood that what Denise needed wasn't words. It was she who spoke first. "When you let me go," she said quietly, not turning to look at him, "I was 4 months pregnant. I hadn't told anyone at the office yet." A pause. "With that job I had health insurance. With that insurance I could have gotten Grace tested from the very beginning, back when the symptoms were minor, and the surgery would have been simpler." The words weren't an attack. They were worse than that. They were a fact. Robert felt the impact of each one with a clarity no corporate crisis meeting had ever given him. Denise won. "I'm not blaming you," she cut him off, turning her face toward him with that look he'd already learned to recognize, direct, unadorned, without unnecessary mercy. "I'm telling you what happened, because you asked me why I was alone on that highway. That's the full answer." Robert had to make a conscious effort to hold her gaze. "After the layoff, I didn't find steady work for months," she continued. "No reference letter, visibly pregnant, doors closed before I could even get them halfway open. When Grace was born and the diagnosis came, her father couldn't handle the weight of it. The laundromat was the only place that would take me under those conditions. 3 shifts, no insurance, no benefits, but at least it was something." "Why didn't you come find me?" Robert asked. "Why would I?" Denise cut in with a calm that was sharper than any anger could have been. "To ask for help from the man who tossed me aside like an unnecessary expense? I've got 4 years of intact pride, Robert. It's the one thing nobody's been able to take from me." Denise Ruiz's pride was real, and it was fair, and it was exactly what hurt Robert Callahan the most in that moment, because it made him invisible in the one direction that mattered. The direction of the damage he'd caused. "How much does the surgery cost?" he asked. Denise looked at him. "Why do you want to know?" "Denise, how much does it cost?" She held his gaze for a long stretch of time, then named the figure. It was a number that, for Robert Callahan, represented less than 2% of what he'd spent the month before renovating his corporate offices. That hit him with a force he hadn't expected. Not the number itself, but the proportion. The brutal math of a world where a 4-year-old couldn't get surgery because her mother didn't have access to an amount that was, for him, literally the cost of putting new marble on a floor that already had marble. "I'm going to pay for the surgery," Robert said. "No, Robert." She repeated it with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. "I don't accept charity from anyone, and especially not from someone who still owes me an apology he hasn't actually given yet." Robert opened his mouth, then closed it. He was in his mid-40s. He'd closed deals with people who wouldn't budge on anything. He'd negotiated agreements others considered impossible to move. He had never faced anything as immovable as the dignity of a woman who had nothing else left but that. "You're right," he said for the second time that day. Denise studied him. "What I did 3 years ago was wrong," he continued, and this time the words didn't come out polished or easy. They came out clumsy and real. "I didn't see you as a person. I saw you as a line item on a spreadsheet. And that had consequences I never once stopped to imagine because it was more convenient not to." A pause. "I'm sorry." Genuinely. The hospital corridor stayed the same. Same walls, same smell, same distant sound of machines and footsteps, and life in all its most urgent forms. But between Robert and Denise, something shifted, as small and as final as the way a door's hinge changes the moment someone cracks it open, just barely. "An apology doesn't operate on grace," Denise said finally. "No," Robert admitted, "but it's the right place to start." Denise looked at him a moment longer, then looked at the door of room 14B, then looked back at him. "There's a meeting tomorrow with the hospital director and a medical foundation," she said. "Last chance to get funding before the timeline closes for good." A pause. "On my own, I don't carry much weight. Nobody listens to me the same way." Robert understood what she wasn't saying outright. "Do you want me to come with you?" Denise took her time answering, and in that pause was the entire distance between pride and a mother's love. "Gracie asked me this morning if she'll get to see the ocean once she's out of the hospital," she said finally, her voice barely holding steady. "She's never seen it. I haven't promised her because I don't promise what I don't know I can deliver." A pause. "But I'd like to be able to promise her that someday—" Robert Callahan felt something inside him that had been shut for far too long begin very slowly to open. The hospital director's office at St. Anne's had nothing in common with the offices where Robert Callahan had spent most of his adult life. No floor-to-ceiling windows, no imported leather chairs, no assistant announcing visitors in a smooth, practiced tone. There was a scratched wooden desk, two plants struggling to survive in a corner without enough light, and stacks of files piled with the particular logic of someone doing too much work on far too small a budget. The director's name was Walter Briggs, gray hair, thick-framed glasses, and that particular look of someone who's learned in seconds to tell the difference between people who come to make promises and people who come to follow through. He'd run that hospital for decades and had seen enough well-dressed people pass through to no longer be impressed by a suit. The representative from the Hope Medical Foundation was named Carol Whitfield, mid-40s, a blue folder on the table, pen in hand, an expression that was kind but guarded. She was the kind of person who'd learned to be gentle precisely because her job mostly consisted of saying no. Denise arrived first. Robert arrived 2 minutes later. When he walked through the door, Walter Briggs looked him over with quiet, professional discretion. Carol Whitfield stopped writing. Denise didn't look at him, but Robert noticed her posture shift slightly, like someone taking a breath before diving in. "Good morning," Robert said, taking a seat next to Denise, without making a ceremony of his presence. Walter Briggs laced his fingers together on the desk. "Ms. Ruiz let us know she'd be coming with someone." It wasn't a question. It was an observation waiting for an explanation. "I'm Robert Callahan," he said. "Callahan Construction." The name did what names do when they carry weight. It shifted the temperature of the room by a degree barely noticeable. Carol Whitfield flipped her folder open faster than before. "So," Walter Briggs continued, not losing his direct tone, "I understand you're here about the case of the Ruiz girl Grace." "That's right," Denise confirmed. Her voice was steady. Her hands, which Robert could see resting on the table, were completely still. The kind of stillness that costs something. "I need the foundation to consider my daughter's case with urgent priority," she said. "Dr. Feld already sent you the test results. The time we have left is—" "I know," Carol Whitfield interrupted gently. "I read the full file this morning." A pause. "Ms. Ruiz, I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve that. Our urgent case list currently has 11 children waiting on funding, 11 families in situations similar to yours. Our funds for this quarter are almost entirely committed." The silence that followed had the weight of something falling with no bottom in sight. Denise barely moved. "Almost," she said. She blinked. "Sorry, you said almost entirely." She repeated it with surgical precision. "That means there's a margin." The foundation representative looked at Denise with something that was starting to resemble respect. "A small margin," she admitted, "but our allocation criteria aren't purely medical. We also evaluate the family's capacity for follow-through, stability of the home environment, likelihood of sustained recovery." Grace has a mother who's been running on 4 hours of sleep for weeks just to pay for the room they live in and still show up at this hospital every single day, Denise said, and her voice didn't rise a single degree. If that's not follow-through, I don't know what is. Robert glanced at her sideways. Walter Briggs looked at her too, and in his expression there was something that wasn't pity. It was recognition. That's when Robert spoke. "I want to put something on the table," he said, addressing both of them with a calm that was natural for him and that in this context carried a different kind of weight. "I'm not here to pressure anyone, and I'm not here to use my name as leverage. I'm here because I made a mistake that had direct consequences on this family's situation, and I believe I bear real responsibility in this." Carol Whitfield set her pen down on the folder. "What kind responsibility?" Walter Briggs asked. "Ms. Ruiz worked for my company." Robert didn't look away. "She was let go abruptly without proper process, and she lost her health coverage at a moment that turned out to be critical for her daughter's health. I'm not going to go into details that don't belong in this meeting, but I do want to say clearly that part of what this family is facing has an origin connected to decisions I made." The silence was different this time. Heavier, more uncomfortable. Denise kept her eyes fixed on the table. "What I'm proposing," Robert continued, "is co-funding. The foundation contributes whatever it can within its available margin. Callahan Construction covers the rest. Not as a corporate donation with a plaque and a press release, no publicity, no tax write-off angle, simply what it actually is, a debt, with a first name, a last name, and a 4-year-old attached to it." Nobody spoke for a moment. Carol Whitfield picked her pen back up, turned it once between her fingers, set it back down. "Mr. Callahan," she said finally, "the foundation can't be party to an arrangement that bypasses our verification protocols. We'd need to document the source of the funds, the agreement between the parties, the structure of the financing." "Of course," Robert said. "My legal team can have full documentation ready within 48 hours. What I need to know today is whether the foundation is willing to be part of this." Carol Whitfield looked at Walter Briggs. The hospital director looked at Denise. "Ms. Ruiz," he said in that voice he used when things stopped being administrative and started being human. "Are you comfortable with this arrangement?" Every eye in the room turned to her. Denise lifted her gaze from the table, looked at the director, then at Carol Whitfield, and finally at Robert with that look he already knew, direct, unadorned, measuring every inch of what she was seeing. "I have one condition," she said. "Tell me," Robert said. "This doesn't make me owe you anything. I don't owe you gratitude. I don't owe you favors. I don't owe you access to my life or Grace's beyond whatever I decide to give freely." A pause. "Grace gets this surgery because she needs it and because it's right, not so somebody can feel good about themselves." The room held its breath. Robert nodded. "That condition is completely fair," he said. "And there's something else," Denise added, her voice dropping just slightly, just enough for the next words to sound different. "I want this documented, not to use against you, but because Grace is going to grow up someday, and she's going to ask me how we made it through. And I want to be able to tell her the whole truth, no convenient version of it." It was the second time in 2 days that Denise Ruiz's words left Robert Callahan without an immediate answer. Not because he had nothing to say, but because what she'd just asked for was the exact opposite of how he'd operated his entire life. Convenient versions. Narratives built to protect an image, half-truths that resembled honesty without actually being it. "It'll be documented," he said finally. Carol Whitfield picked up her pen a third time, and this time she actually wrote something down. Walter Briggs eased back slightly in his chair and exhaled with the quiet discretion of someone who's spent years hoping things would work out and still isn't quite used to it when they actually do. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. They discussed timelines, paperwork coordination with the surgical team. It was determined that the surgery could be scheduled for the following week if the funds were confirmed within 2 days. Dr. Feld was called in briefly to confirm availability. When they stepped out into the hallway, the hospital was still the same. Same walls, same smell, same urgent hum of life in every form. But something between Robert and Denise had shifted position, the way pieces shift when something doesn't have its final shape yet but is starting to. They walked in silence to the main entrance. Outside, the mid-morning light was different from the day before, less harsh, more honest. "Why'd you do it that way?" Denise asked once they stopped at the door. "You could have just wired the money and never shown up. Nobody was forcing you to be here." Robert thought about his answer before giving it, not because he didn't know it, but because he wanted to get it right. Because the easy thing would have been exactly that. "Wire the money and never show up," he said. "Buy the solution without ever looking it in the face. I've spent too many years already doing things the easy way." Denise looked at him. "That doesn't automatically make you a good person," she said. "I know. It just makes you someone who's trying to be one." "I know that too." A brief silence, different from the ones before. "I'm going to go see Grace," Denise said, taking a step back inside. She stopped without turning around. "The juice from the machine I promised her yesterday costs $1.50. A small pause, almost imperceptible. In case you want to come along." And she kept walking without waiting for him. Robert Callahan stood for a second at the hospital entrance, the mid-morning light falling on his shoulders, and the quiet certainty that whatever had just begun had nothing to do with money. And he followed her. The juice machine sat in the main hallway, next to a window overlooking the hospital's inner courtyard. It was an old machine, its buttons worn smooth by thousands of fingers, with a constant hum nobody noticed anymore, because it had become part of the background noise of the place. Robert fed in the coins. 2 small orange juice boxes dropped out, the kind with a straw built right into the package, the kind of thing that simply didn't exist in his everyday life. Because in his everyday life, there were assistants who made sure there was always cold sparkling water and single-origin coffee waiting in meetings. Denise took one without a word and walked toward room 14B. Robert walked behind her juice box in hand, feeling, for the first time in many years, completely out of his element, and discovering that the feeling wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Grace greeted them with her usual energy, that particular energy-sick kids have on their good days, focused bright as if the body saves everything it has for the moments worth spending it on. "2 juices," she announced with the same satisfaction she would have shown if they'd brought her something far more valuable. "The other one's for you, Mr. Robert." "It was actually mine," he said. "But if you want it—" "No." Grace cut him off, suddenly serious. "Everybody gets their own. That's what Mom taught me." A thoughtful pause. "Although if you've got a sip left over, you can give it to me." Denise let out a short, genuine laugh, the kind that shows up without permission and is because of that the most real kind. Robert felt that sound as something he hadn't expected to feel. Relief. He sat down in the same plastic chair from the day before. Denise settled onto the edge of the bed next to Grace, and for a while the three of them shared that particular silence of juice boxes sipped slowly because there's no rush and because the moment itself is already enough. It was Grace who spoke first, like almost always. "Do you have kids, Mr. Robert?" The question arrived without warning, the way all the important questions from kids do. "I have a son," he answered. "His name is Tyler. He's 11. It was the first time he'd mentioned him since walking into that hospital. And saying it out loud in that room, in front of that little girl, he felt the full weight of everything that sentence implied. An 11-year-old he saw on weekends when work allowed, who lived with his mother since the separation, who called him Dad with a courtesy that sometimes sounded more like protocol than closeness. "Does he miss you?" Grace asked. "I hope so," Robert said, and the honesty in those 3 words surprised even him. Grace processed that with the ability kids have to receive adult truths without judging them, just filing them away somewhere. "I miss my dad," she said, "but he lives far away." A pause. "Mom says sometimes people go far away and it's not because they don't love you, it's because they've got hard stuff inside that they don't know how to fix." She looked up at him. "Do you think that's true?" Robert looked at Denise. She had her eyes on the white sheet, folding a small crease between her fingers with the concentration of someone who needs her hands busy so she doesn't fall apart. "I think your mom is very wise," Robert answered. Grace nodded with the absolute conviction of someone who already knew that. I think so too. She took the last sip of her juice. Tell me something. What do you want me to tell you? Whatever you want, but it has to be true. I can always tell when a story's made up. Robert smiled. Not a boardroom smile, not a polite social smile. A real one that came on its own. How can you tell? Because when something's made up, the person's eyes look up. Grace explained with total seriousness. Nurse Pat taught me that. She says it's because the brain's looking for the story up on the ceiling. That's a very interesting theory. It's not a theory, it's true. She crossed her arms with determination. So tell me something. True. Robert thought for a moment and then, without planning it, said something he'd never said out loud before. When I was a kid, I wanted to build bridges. Not office buildings, bridges. Because it seemed like the most useful thing anyone could build something that connects two places that couldn't touch each other before. Grace looked at him with total attention. So why didn't you do that? Because someone told me office buildings made more money, and I believed him. And do you regret it now? Robert found himself looking, without meaning to, at the drawings taped to the wall. The little house with smoke. The flowers, the clouds. I think I do. Grace considered that for several seconds. You can still build a bridge, she said finally with that childlike logic that solves in one sentence what adults spend years overcomplicating. You don't look that old. Denise looked up from the sheet. Her eyes met Robert's for a brief instant, and in that instant there was something that wasn't the hospital or the morning meeting or the debt or the surgery. It was something smaller and harder to name. Robert looked away first. Mid-morning, Nurse Pat came in with Grace's medication, a small pill Grace took with a sip of water, and the expression of someone honoring a long-standing agreement. How many pills have you had so far? Robert asked. A lot, Grace answered. I lost count, but Nurse Pat says each one's like a little soldier going in to guard my heart until the doctor comes to fix it. Do you like that explanation? Yeah. A pause. Although sometimes I think the soldiers must be pretty tired of waiting. Robert felt those words land in a specific place in his chest that he couldn't fully identify but recognized as real. They're not going to have to wait much longer, Grace said, looking at him. Promise? The question was simple, direct, with that absolute trust 4-year-olds have when they decide an adult is worth believing. Robert knew the weight of promises. He'd broken enough of them in his life to know exactly how heavy they get when they're not kept. With partners, with clients, with Tyler, with people who'd trusted his word and found instead a carefully worded legal document. But this one was different. I promise, he said. Grace nodded once with the solemnity of someone who's just signed the most important agreement in the world. Good. She leaned back against her pillow with the satisfaction of someone who's just resolved something that had been hanging over her. Then when they fix my heart, I want to go see the ocean. She looked at him. Is the ocean real or just in pictures? It's real. It's exactly as big as they say. It's bigger than you can imagine right now. Grace closed her eyes with a small, peaceful smile. The smile of someone who's just received exactly what she needed. Denise, who had been quiet the last few minutes, stood up gently and adjusted her daughter's pillow with those precise, loving movements that are the private language of mothers. They stepped into the hallway once Grace fell asleep. The corridor was quieter than it had been that morning, midday light coming through the window at the far end, turning the gray concrete into something almost warm. You shouldn't have promised her that, Denise said, but her voice held no hardness, just an honest warning. I know, Robert admitted, but it was true. True promises can get broken too. Not this one. Denise looked at him for a moment. When's the last time you saw Tyler? She asked. The question came with no obvious transition, but Robert understood immediately why she was asking. It wasn't really a question about Tyler. It was a question about him. 3 weeks ago, he answered. Why? Work. It's always work. Yeah, Robert said. It's always work. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only exists between people who've stopped pretending everything is fine. "Grace hasn't been able to leave that room in weeks," Denise said, finally looking at the closed door of 14B. "And in that time, she's learned the names of every nurse. She knows which days the sun comes through the window and which days it doesn't. She's memorized the sounds of the hallway, and she can tell you whether the medication cart is the morning one or the afternoon one, just by the sound of its wheels." A pause. "She doesn't waste anything, not a single moment of anything." Robert listened to that and thought about everything he had wasted, not in the abstract, specifically. The calls from Tyler he'd put off for later, the birthdays he'd shown up late for, the nights he'd chosen a report over a conversation. "I need to call him today," he said. "Tyler." Denise said nothing more, but something in her posture settled slightly, the way tension that's been sitting there unnamed finally finds a way to loosen just a little. "Surgery's scheduled for next week if the funds get confirmed tomorrow," she said, shifting back to practical reality. With that ability she had to move between the emotional world and the concrete one without losing her footing in either. "The funds will be confirmed tomorrow," Robert said. "How can you be sure? Because tonight I'm personally going to go through every document and every transfer needed to make sure there's no possible delay." Denise looked at him. "Why is it so hard for me to believe you?" "Because I had to earn it, and I still haven't earned it fully," he answered without hesitating. That answer threw her off balance. Robert saw it. And he also saw what came after, not trust yet, but something close to it from a distance. The minimal opening of someone who has decided against her own instinct for self-protection to give the possibility of things being different a chance. "I'll confirm the funds first thing tomorrow morning," Robert said. "I'll be here first thing tomorrow morning," Denise answered. They parted ways at the hospital entrance. Midday light, honest heat, the distant sound of the city going about its own rhythm, unaware of what had just happened in that hallway. Robert reached his car, pulled out his phone, and found the contact simply labeled Tyler. He dialed. It rang 3 times. "Dad?" said an 11-year-old voice with that mix of surprise and caution that develops when calls aren't frequent. "Hey, buddy," Robert said. "How was your day?" And for the first time in a long time, he actually meant the question. The funds were confirmed at 9 the next morning, exactly as Robert had promised. There was no celebration, no emotional phone call, no message loaded with grand words. There was an email from Callahan Construction's legal department to the Hope Medical Foundation, with every document in order, every signature in place, every amount verified. Clean, complete, no loose ends. Denise read it 3 times sitting in the room where she and Grace had lived before the hospital admitted her. A small room in an old building in the Riverside neighborhood with a window facing a brick wall and a kitchen that was really just a hot plate on a shelf. The kind of place you rent when all that matters is having a roof and a price you can actually afford. She read the email 3 times, then closed it. She didn't cry. She'd spent so long saving her tears for moments when Grace couldn't see her that she almost didn't know how to let them out anymore when she was alone. She typed a short message. "Got it. Thank you." Robert answered in under a minute. "How is she today?" Denise stared at the question for several seconds. It was a simple question, but it came from someone who 2 days ago had just been a figure from her past that she'd deliberately chosen not to remember, and who was now asking about her daughter with a familiarity that had no obvious place in the neat narrative she'd built for herself to survive. She answered, "Good. Nervous, though? She doesn't say so." "And you?" She looked at that question longer still, then turned off her phone and went to get ready for her shift at the laundromat. The surgery was scheduled for 7 the next morning. That afternoon, when Denise got to the hospital, she found Grace quieter than usual. It wasn't the stillness of pain. It was the stillness of someone processing something too big for her size. Nurse Pat had explained to Grace what was going to happen with that particular skill of hers for turning hard things into something a kid could hold on to. Tomorrow, some very skilled doctors were going to go in and fix her heart while she slept a special sleep, and when she woke up, she was going to feel like she could breathe in a way she'd never felt before. Grace had listened to all of it in silence. Then she'd asked if it was going to hurt. Pat had told her that when she woke up it would a little, but she'd be surrounded by people taking care of her. Grace had nodded and hadn't said much of anything for a few hours. When Denise walked into the room, her daughter was staring at the ceiling with the concentration kids get when they're thinking about something they don't have words for yet. "Hi, my love," Denise said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Hi, Mom." A brief silence. "Are you scared?" Denise asked gently. Grace took a little while. "A little," she admitted. "But Nurse Pat says being scared is just your body telling you something important is about to happen. That it's not bad, it's like when your hands shake before you open a really big present." Denise felt something tighten in her throat. "That's exactly what it is," she said. Grace turned her head toward her mother. "Are you scared too, Mom?" "Yes, the same kind. The exact same kind." Grace reached out her small hand and put it on top of her mother's, a gesture so simple and so complete that Denise had to look toward the window to keep from breaking down in front of her. "Then we're both scared together," Grace said. "That's better than being scared alone, right?" "Much better," Denise confirmed, her voice barely holding. They were the most important words anyone had said to her in years, and they'd come from a 4-year-old in a hospital bed with an empty juice box straw on the nightstand and 3 drawings taped to the wall. Robert arrived at the hospital at 6 that evening. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't fully know why he'd come. He only knew that that morning he'd been in his office looking at contracts, and at some point he'd stopped reading them because his mind was in that hospital hallway with a little girl who had tired little soldiers inside her chest. He found Denise in the corridor, standing by the window overlooking the courtyard, holding a cup of coffee she clearly hadn't touched since it was still full and had to be cold by now. She saw him arrive and said nothing. She just waited. "How is she?" he asked. Quiet, thinking. A pause. "She fell asleep a while ago. Pat says it's good for her to rest well tonight." Robert leaned against the wall next to her. The courtyard had a small tree nobody had deliberately planted there. One that had simply grown on its own between the cracks in the concrete with that quiet stubbornness of things that decide to exist without asking anyone's permission. "I killed the North River pedestrian bridge project last year," Robert said suddenly. Denise looked at him. "It was a footbridge meant to connect 2 neighborhoods that had been cut off from each other by a ravine for decades," he continued. "The feasibility study said it wasn't profitable. I canceled it in 15 minutes in a meeting where nobody objected because nobody objects when the numbers say no." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because today I was thinking about what I told Grace, that as a kid I wanted to build bridges because they connect things that can't touch each other." A pause. "And I realized I've spent years building exactly the opposite." Denise didn't answer right away. She looked at the tree in the courtyard. "Did you call Tyler yesterday?" she asked. "Yeah." "How'd it go?" "Awkward at first," Robert admitted. "Like when somebody does something they're not used to doing and the other person doesn't quite know how to take it. But then he told me about a science project on freshwater ecosystems and how worried he was he wouldn't have enough time to do it right." A pause. "We talked for 40 minutes. I didn't know he could talk like that." "He's your son." "He's my son." Denise turned her face toward him. There was something in her expression that wasn't exactly tenderness, but that came close from an unexpected angle. "The 2 of them have that in common," she said. "Grace doesn't stop talking either, once she finds somebody who actually listens to her." "And you?" Robert asked. "Me what?" "When's the last time somebody actually listened to you?" The question hung between them in the quiet hallway. Denise looked at her cold coffee, then at the tree in the courtyard, then at Robert with that direct look he already knew, but that this time had something different in it. A small crack, the kind that doesn't show up from weakness, but from the opposite, from the enormous exhaustion of having been strong for far too long without a break. "I don't remember," she said finally. Robert said nothing. He just listened because that was exactly what she'd answered without saying it. And then Denise talked. Not dramatically, not the kind of confession that's angling for impact. She talked the way people talk when they haven't done it in a long time and suddenly find a space where it's possible, slowly, with pauses. Choosing her words carefully, like someone walking across ground she doesn't fully know but needs to cross anyway. She talked about the first months after the layoff, about the days when Grace was a newborn and the diagnosis landed like a stone dropped from very high up. About how she'd learned to read medical studies on her phone during shifts at the laundromat because nobody else was going to learn them for her. About the nights Grace had trouble breathing and she'd hold her and sing to her in a voice that didn't shake because if a mother's voice shakes, little kids feel it and it scares them worse. About how she'd learned to compartmentalize the fear, to keep it in separate boxes so it didn't fill everything at once and leave her unable to function. "Did you ever think about giving up?" Robert asked carefully. "No," Denise said without hesitating. "Never." A pause. "But there were nights I thought I wasn't going to be able to keep going, that it was too much for one person." She looked at the tree in the courtyard. "And then morning would come and Grace would look at me with those eyes and ask if I had something new to tell her today, and I'd make something up, and she'd laugh, and the day would have a reason again." Robert listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the hallway was completely silent. Outside, the tree in the courtyard was still there, small and stubborn, growing in the only spot it had managed to find. "Tomorrow at 7, Robert said finally. "Tomorrow at 7, Denise confirmed. "I'll be here." Robert looked at her. "You don't have to be." "I know." She held his gaze for a moment and then, with the same ease Grace had shown putting her hand on her mother's hours earlier, she said, "The coffee from the machine on the 3rd floor is less terrible than the one on the 1st floor, in case you get here early." And she walked back toward her daughter's room. Robert stood alone in the hallway with that completely useless and completely necessary piece of information. He left the hospital once it was dark. In the parking lot before starting the car, he pulled out his phone and wrote a message to Tyler. "How's the ecosystem project going? If you want, I can help with the model this weekend." The reply came in 30 seconds. "Seriously, yes. Do I get to pick which ecosystem?" Robert smiled in the dark of the parking lot. "You pick," he wrote, and pulled out toward home, carrying something he hadn't carried in the car in a very long time. The feeling that tomorrow actually mattered. 7 in the morning at St. Anne's Public Hospital had a sound all its own. Not the silence of the middle of the night, not the full noise of midday, something in between. Fast footsteps of staff coming on shift equipment carts rolling down hallways, low voices coordinating without drama the logistics of saving lives before most of the city had even finished waking up. Robert arrived at 6:40. He went up to the 3rd floor, found the coffee machine Denise had mentioned, and confirmed it was, in fact, less bad than the one on the 1st floor. He stood by the window with the paper cup in his hands, looking out at the inner courtyard, where the small, stubborn tree was still there, same as always, asking no one's permission to exist. Denise arrived 10 minutes later. She saw him by the window and stopped for a second, barely noticeable before continuing toward him. She was carrying the same kind of exhaustion she always carried in her eyes, but this morning there was something extra. A specific tension around her jaw that Robert already knew how to recognize as the outward version of a fear she wasn't going to name out loud. He handed her a cup of coffee without a word. She took it without a word. For a moment, the two of them looked at the courtyard in silence, and that silence was the kind that doesn't need filling, because it already holds everything it needs to. "They already took her to prep," Denise said finally. "I went in to see her before they closed the area." She was calm. A pause. "She asked me to look after her bear while she had her special sleep." Robert glanced at Denise's bag. The pink ear of the teddy bear peeked out from the top. "How did Nurse Pat handle it?" "With a song," Denise said, and her voice cracked on the last word, with that small fracture that shows up when emotion finds the only crack available. She sang something soft while she started the IV. Grace closed her eyes and asked if the soldiers were ready. Pat told her they were already lined up and waiting. Robert didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish what he'd just heard. They went down together to the surgical waiting area. It was a different kind of room than the rest of the hospital. Smaller, quieter chairs lined up against the walls, and a table with old magazines nobody read because nobody in that room had the capacity to focus on anything besides the closed door at the end of the corridor. Other families were waiting too. An older couple holding hands without speaking, a young woman staring at her phone without really seeing it, a middle-aged man who kept standing up, taking 3 steps and sitting back down again in a cycle that repeated every few minutes. Robert and Denise sat down together. Time in that room had a different quality than time in the outside world. Out there, time moves forward. In here, time suspends itself at a fixed point, and all that exists is the waiting and the closed door and the sound of your own thoughts. For the first hour, they barely spoke. Denise had the teddy bear on her lap, hands crossed over it, eyes on the door. Robert sat beside her, elbows on his knees, head tilted slightly, present in a way that didn't need words. It was he who spoke first. "The dad Tyler knows isn't the dad I wanted to be when he was born," he said out of nowhere, the way important things come out when your guard is down. "When Tyler was born, I cried. I went to the hospital bathroom so nobody would see me, and I cried for several minutes, because I'd never felt anything like that. That absolute clarity that something mattered more than anything else." Denise listened without looking at him, and then I walked out of the bathroom and returned 3 work calls that had come in while I was in there, and at some point between that day and this one, I lost the thread that connected me to that clarity. He looked down at his own hands. "I don't know exactly when. That's the worst part. There's no specific moment where I can say, that's where it happened. It was gradual. So gradual, I didn't even feel it. That's how almost every important loss happens," Denise said quietly. "Not all at once, little by little, until one day you look and it's just not there anymore." Robert nodded. "Did you lose something like that?" he asked. "Besides what you already know?" Denise took her time. "I lost the version of myself that believed things work out if you do everything right. I worked hard. I was responsible. I showed up on time. I followed through on everything, and they still took my job away. They still took my insurance. They still took my stability." A pause. "It took me a while to understand that the world doesn't work like an equation, where if you put in the right ingredients, you get the right result. Sometimes it goes wrong anyway, even when you do everything right, and you have to keep going regardless." "How did you learn to keep going?" Denise looked down at the teddy bear in her hands. "Grace," she said simply. "The first day I held her and she looked at me with those huge eyes that didn't know anything about the world, yet I thought this person didn't choose to be born into this situation. Nobody asked her if she wanted this. So the only thing that makes any sense is making sure it's worth it." The door to the surgical area stayed closed. The man who kept pacing 3 steps and sitting back down kept his cycle going. The older couple stayed hand in hand. Outside, the hospital kept running on its own logic, indifferent to the suspended time in that small waiting room. 2 hours in, Dr. Feld came through the door. They both stood up at the same time. The doctor looked at them with that trained expression that gives nothing away before it's the right moment. And Robert felt in those 3 seconds of distance between the door and where they stood something he hadn't felt since he was a kid. Real fear. Not the calculated fear of business risk. Fear with no possible control over it. "How is she?" Denise asked, and her voice came out completely steady. The kind of steadiness that costs everything a person has. "The surgery is going well," Dr. Feld said. "The team found the valve in worse shape than the latest test showed, which means the decision to operate now was absolutely the right one." A pause. "They'll need about 2 more hours. I wanted to come out and update you both personally because I know the waiting is the hardest part." Denise let out a single sound, brief and complete, like the release of something she'd been holding with too much effort. "She's okay," she repeated, needing the direct confirmation. "She's okay," Dr. Feld confirmed. "She's a very strong little girl." When the doctor went back through the door, Denise sat down slowly, and then without warning, without transition, without the usual control that kept everything in check, she covered her face with her hands and cried. Robert's phone buzzed. "Dad texts me how it's going. Also about the ecosystem thing this weekend, still on. Still on, Tyler. Definitely still on. You picked the ecosystem yet? Amazon River. Already started researching. I'll send you what I found. Robert put his phone away and felt something without a precise name, but which was a form of gratitude. He showed the exchange to Denise without a word. She read it. A small smile appeared on her face. The first one of the morning. Amazon River, she said. Ambitious. Takes after me, Robert answered. And in that moment, in that waiting room, with plastic chairs and old magazines and suspended time, something between them settled into a place that didn't have a name yet, but was real and solid and completely different from anything that had existed between the two of them before. The door to the surgical area opened 2 hours later. Dr. Feld came out with a different expression than before. Not the trained expression of someone delivering information. The expression of someone who's just been part of something worth all of it. The surgery was a success, he said. 3 words. Denise closed her eyes and kept them closed for several seconds, the teddy bear pressed against her chest exactly the way Grace had held it when Robert first saw her on that empty highway. "Can I see her?" she asked, eyes still closed. "In about an hour, once she's out of the anesthesia," Dr. Feld answered. "And, Ms. Ruiz, I want you to know that your daughter, even asleep, even in the operating room at one point, made a motion with her hand like she was holding something." Denise opened her eyes. Nurse Pat said she was probably reaching for her bear. The doctor continued with a smile that had nothing to do with protocol. "So I think whatever she asks for first when she wakes up, that's what she's going to get." Denise looked down at the bear in her hands, and this time the tears didn't ask permission. Robert stood beside her, and when Denise, without thinking, without calculating, without her usual shield of years of loneliness and resistance, leaned her forehead briefly against his shoulder for a second, no more than a second, he didn't move. He just stayed there, which was exactly what was needed. When they pulled apart, neither of them mentioned it. There was no neither to. Some things don't need naming to be real. "I'm going to go find Nurse Pat," Denise said, recovering her practical voice, with that ability of hers to move between worlds without losing her footing in either. "I'll go get coffee," Robert said. "3rd floor." "Good," she said. And as they walked off in different directions down that hallway they now knew by heart, both of them knew without saying it that in an hour Grace would wake up and the pink bear would be waiting for her. Grace woke up from the anesthesia asking for her bear. It was the first thing she said before asking for her mom, before asking if it had hurt, before processing where she was or what had happened. Her eyes opened slowly in that recovery room with its dim lights and quiet machines, and her first word was a name stitched in blue thread. "Where's Buttons?" Denise, who'd been sitting beside the bed for 40 minutes waiting for that exact moment, placed the pink bear in her daughter's hands before the question had even finished coming out. Grace hugged it against her chest, eyes still half closed. "He was waiting for you," Denise said in a voice that wasn't entirely steady and wasn't trying to be. "I know," Grace murmured with that quiet certainty kids have about things they don't doubt. "I was waiting for him too." She closed her eyes again, but this time it wasn't the sleep of the anesthesia. It was the clean sleep of someone who, for the first time in a long time, can truly rest, because something that had been broken for far too long had just been fixed. Dr. Feld checked her vitals an hour later and said a sentence Denise put away somewhere reserved for things you never forget. "Her heart is working the way it always should have." Recovery took days that were slow at first, and then began speeding up with that particular momentum good things pick up once they finally arrive. Grace was the kind of patient who drove the doctors happily crazy. She asked the name of every medication. She wanted to know exactly what every machine hooked to her body was for. And on the 3rd day of recovery, she asked Nurse Pat to teach her how to read the heart rate monitor because she wanted to see with her own eyes how her fixed heart was beating. Pat showed her. Grace watched the green line rise and fall on the screen for a long moment. "It used to get tired," she said. "Now it doesn't get tired anymore, right?" "It's got a lot more strength now," Pat confirmed. Grace nodded with the seriousness of someone who's just received the most important piece of information of her life. "So the soldiers can rest now," she said. "They already did their job." Robert came back to the hospital every single day during recovery. He didn't make announcements about it. He didn't plan it as a strategy, and he didn't think of it as some calculated gesture. He just showed up the way he'd shown up the afternoon before the surgery because it was where he needed to be, and he'd stopped looking for a rational justification for that. He brought juice from the machine in the hallway. He sat in the plastic chair. He listened to Grace talk about the heart monitor, about the dreams she'd had under anesthesia, about a book of ocean animals Nurse Pat had gotten her, which Grace studied with the focus of a researcher. One day he brought Tyler. He hadn't planned it. Tyler had called that morning asking how the little girl from the hospital was doing, and Robert, instead of answering with a text, had said, "Want to come meet her?" Tyler had taken exactly 2 seconds to say yes. When they walked into the room together, Grace looked up from her Ocean Animals book and studied Tyler with that same absolute frankness of hers. "You're the one with the river ecosystem," she said. Tyler blinked, surprised she knew that. "My dad told me," Grace explained, completely matter-of-fact. "You picked the Amazon." "Yeah," Tyler said, still processing that a 4-year-old in a hospital bed knew that. "Good choice," Grace approved. "There's pink dolphins in the Amazon. Did you know that?" "No," Tyler admitted. "Well, now you do." She turned back to her book. "You can sit down if you want. There's a chair." Tyler looked at his father. Robert made a gesture that said, "Told you," and Tyler sat down. For the next hour, Grace explained everything she'd learned about ocean animals to Tyler. Tyler told her about the Amazon project, and at some point in that conversation, the two kids were leaning over the same book, pointing at things and seriously debating whether a whale shark technically counted as a fish or something more complicated than that. Robert and Denise watched from the side of the room. "3 weeks ago, I didn't know Tyler could talk like that with someone he'd just met," Robert said quietly. "3 weeks ago, you didn't know how to listen to him either," Denise answered without any edge to it. Robert considered that. "You're right. I usually am," she said. And there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before, something light, almost close to humor that showed up uninvited, and that they both let stand without commenting on it. Weeks later, Grace was discharged from the hospital. Dr. Feld signed the paperwork with the quiet satisfaction of someone who does their job well and knows when something turned out exactly as it should. Nurse Pat gave Grace a new book, this one, about oceans, with photographs that filled entire pages and colors that seemed almost too vivid to be real. Grace hugged it alongside the pink bear one in each arm and told Pat that when she grew up, she wanted to be either a doctor or a sailor. She hadn't decided yet. "You can be both," Pat said. Grace considered that with total seriousness. "Dr. Sailor," she said finally. "That works." While Denise finished the discharge paperwork in the hallway, Robert crouched down in front of Grace until he was at her eye level. "Remember what I promised you?" he asked. Grace looked at him with those eyes that never forgot anything. "The ocean," she said. "The ocean," he confirmed. "It's real. This week, you're going to see it for yourself." Grace processed that for a moment. Then she looked at the ocean book in her arms, then looked back at Robert. "Is it as blue as in the pictures?" "It's bluer than that, and it makes a sound that doesn't sound like anything else." Grace nodded slowly, with the solemnity of someone receiving confirmation of something she'd waited a long time for, without ever being completely sure it was real. "Okay," she said. "Then let's go." The ocean welcomed them on a morning of wide-open sky and a gentle breeze. All 4 of them went, Denise, Grace, Robert, and Tyler. No ceremony, no excessive planning. With that kind of simplicity, things carry once they stop needing to justify themselves. Grace saw the ocean for the first time from the edge of a beach with no famous name, no crowds of tourists, just clean sand and water, stretching as far as the eye could see, and then still going. She stopped. She didn't run toward the water the way Robert had imagined she would. She stood at the edge, completely still for a moment, nobody interrupted, staring at that expanse of blue with an expression that wasn't quite wonder, it was closer to recognition, as if something she'd been waiting for without knowing it had finally arrived. Then she turned toward her mother. "Mom?" she said in a voice that was somehow the smallest and the biggest at the same time. "Dad can see this too from where he is." Denise knelt down in the sand beside her daughter. "Yes, my love," she said. "Everything you see, he sees it with you." Grace nodded, then looked back out at the ocean. "Then it's okay," she said, "because it's too pretty not to be seen." Denise closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then she opened them and took her daughter's hand, and they walked together toward the water. Robert stayed a few steps back with Tyler beside him. "Hey, Dad," Tyler said quietly, watching the scene in front of them. "I'm glad you stopped the car that day." Robert looked at his son. 11 years old. The same set of the jaw he had when he was thinking hard about something. Eyes on Grace and Denise walking hand in hand into the water. "Me too," Robert said. They stood there in silence for a moment. "Can we come back sometime, just the two of us?" Tyler asked. "To the ocean, I mean. No rush, whenever you want," Robert answered. "You pick the date." Tyler nodded with that quiet satisfaction of someone who's just gotten exactly what he needed without having to ask twice. Weeks after that day, Robert signed the paperwork to reactivate the North River Pedestrian Bridge project. There was no corporate press release, no ribbon-cutting photo op. There was a signature, a brief meeting with his engineering team, and one clear instruction. The footbridge connecting the two neighborhoods separated by the ravine would be built to the highest safety standards, every worker with full equipment, every protocol double-checked, no exceptions, no shortcuts, none of the margin-driven logic that had governed his decisions for far too many years. In the project file, he wrote a note nobody asked him to write, and that wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, and was at the same time addressed to everyone. This bridge connects two places that should have always been able to touch. Built in honor of every worker who deserves to go home safe every night. He didn't sign the note with his name. It didn't need it. Denise left the laundromat a month later, not because Robert asked her to, and not because Grace's medical situation solved everything on its own. She left because Director Walter Briggs, after watching how she'd handled every medical conversation, every negotiation with the foundation, every hard decision with a clarity and presence he'd rarely seen in people with twice her experience, offered her a position in the hospital's social case management department. The first day Denise walked through St. Anne's front doors, as staff, Nurse Pat was waiting for her in the hallway with 2 coffees from the machine on the 3rd floor. "The first day's always the hardest," Pat said. "No," Denise answered, taking the cup. "The first day was a long time ago. This is the one that comes after." Grace had her birthday weeks after being discharged. Denise asked her what she wanted as a gift. Grace thought about it for a stretch of time that seemed disproportionate for such a simple question, with that seriousness of hers that had never really belonged to a kid her age, but to someone who'd learned early that things matter. "I want to go to the ocean again," she said finally. "But this time I want to bring a seashell for Dad, so he has something from the ocean where he is." Denise looked at her for a long moment. "We can do that," she said. "And can Mr. Robert come? And the dolphin one?" "If they want to." "They want to," Grace said with total certainty. "I already know they do."